Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about fatigue. We're going to be talking about it from a physiological perspective, so what's happening in the body, and then we're going to be talking about it from a psychological perspective, which I think as coaches and athletes, that's the really applicable side. Doesn't really matter that much if you know what's happening inside the body while it's happening to you. It just matters how you perceive it and how you react to it.
If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. Get better at the sport of CrossFit alongside some of the best athletes in the world in our online training program, The Design. Head over to our website, trainingthinktank.com/DSGN to learn more.
We recorded.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so today...
No. Before we start, Kyle, flex on these hoes. We got the champion wearing the champion's hoodie.
Right.
Turn around, do a spin.
I got the white jersey on.
Tell them what you won. That's right.
You know, what's crazy is I didn't even get tired when I was there because I didn't experience fatigue. Today, what we're going to be talking about is fatigue.
Well, for those that don't know.
I'm supposed to go through all that. Okay, so...
No. Just say what you did.
Yeah, I won the Masters Fitness Collective 35-39.
Now flex the bicep.
What's up?
All right, now go back to the podcast.
I got a long sleeves t-shirt on, Chris. It doesn't make any sense.
Go.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about fatigue. We're going to be talking about it from a physiological perspective, so what's happening in the body, and then we're going to be talking about it from a psychological perspective, which I think as coaches and athletes, that's the really applicable side. Doesn't really matter that much if you know what's happening inside the body while it's happening to you. It just matters how you perceive it and how you react to it. So digging into this today, we've got Evan Peikon, one of the coaches with us today, and he's going to go in depth into some of the science because that's his mastery. So Evan, tell us a little bit about fatigue today.
Great
Sweet.
Yeah, perfect, Ivan. So yeah, I think it would be really useful to talk about some of the stories that people tell themselves with fatigue, and maybe we could start to kind of unravel some of those and explain that maybe some of these stories that athletes tell themselves and that coaches might tell athletes, they might not be entirely perfect pictures of reality, and why that would actually be an important thing for us to get into as coaches or as athletes. How does understanding all of these processes improve our performance, our ability to work with athletes?
So first off, what do you mean when you say stories that athletes tell themselves? Can you make that a little more clear for me?
Yes, so I'm sure being around competitive athletics for yourself for as long as you have, you ask someone after an event, you were a swimmer, why couldn't you swim faster? What were you experiencing?
I'm following you now.
And maybe you can list like 2 or 3 common things that you've heard. What would those be?
So in a swimming event, it might be something like, oh, my shoulders were completely blown up. Although in swimming, we wouldn't have used that terminology. That's CrossFit terminology to explain
Let's use a CrossFit example since this is a...
Yeah. So it'd be like strict handstand push-ups. Like what happened in the middle of the strict handstand push-ups? I don't know. My shoulders, they just blew up. They got so pumped, I couldn't keep going. Like I don't know what happened. Right. It was like one of those things, but you're starting to tell yourself a story that like every time I do strict handstand push-ups, my shoulders get so pumped that I can't keep going. Is that really what's happening? Maybe not. Right.
Even some of the common ones that I hear, I think I hear 3 main ones that I get from athletes all the time because I do a lot of physiological testing. So I always try and ask athletes afterwards, hey, why didn't you go further? Why did you stop? And the 3 things that I hear are, I had too much lactate buildup in my legs. It was just this lactic acid was burning me up and I couldn't push through that. Or I ran out of fuel on there. So I'm just fuel depleted and I can't push any further because I don't have glycogen in my muscles, or my CNS is fried. As if you could actually exhaust your CNS in some kind of Metcon. Maybe if you're going for 9.5 hours straight, that's going to be a factor.
Wouldn't they be asleep at that point if their CNS was exhausted?
Yeah, I don't know where these things necessarily come from. Who decided that heavy deadlift exhausts your CNS? I don't know, but these are the 3 things that I commonly hear. And it's always interesting to me because all 3 of these are really simple stories. They're not really getting into nuance or complexity. So what I always start to think about is kind of this difference between apparent reality and true reality. So the apparent reality for these athletes is what they experience. Well, when I stopped doing this Metcon, my legs were burning a lot. So that has to be the thing that limited me because that's what I'm experiencing.
And then they have a surface level understanding of physiology and they have heard that lactate is the thing that makes their legs burn. So they start to tell themselves this story that my legs were burning, so it was lactate, and that's the story they've told themselves.
Yeah, one of the things that humans are really good at, and it's one of the things that helped us get to where we are now, is having limited information and kind of making a post hoc assessment to explain it or justify it in the aftermath. So we think, okay, my legs were burning when I was doing this Metcon. Well, how do I justify the fact that I stopped prematurely? Well, it must be because I had lactate in my muscles, because that's a sciencey term that I've heard. And then that becomes the thing that's the athlete's limiter. And then they just compound that story over and over. And then eventually when you start coaching them and you ask them, hey, what are some common things that limit you in Metcons? They have these kind of 2 or 3 packaged answers. And then as coaches, we need to try and dissect that, understand why an athlete feels that way, and maybe try and figure out what some of their real limitations are. Why couldn't they really go faster in a Metcon?
So looking at this, what are some of the actual things that can cause people to stop? What are the mechanisms of fatigue that would lead me? So say I'm in the middle of an assault bike thruster in Metcon and my legs are blowing up or my legs are burning. What is actually going on that's bringing me to a grinding halt there?
Yes, I think we need to think about this from almost like a top-down perspective and a bottoms-up perspective, like a mechanistic versus a big picture view.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, when we're doing a Metcon, we're not thinking about what is my blood pressure regulation like and all of these different factors. It's like, hey, I'm in a lot of pain right now. My legs really hurt, and I just want to stop. So I stopped because I was in pain and my legs were burning up. But at the end of the day, it's not like there's going to be some catastrophe if you don't stop and you're just going to pass out and die or explode. Your brain's sending you these signals of pain and fatigue. So I think what we need to acknowledge is that these feelings that we experience in a Metcon, it's your brain exerting a protective effect on you. So something is happening inside your body that if you keep pushing indefinitely, you're going to run into trouble at one point or another. So your brain's going to send you these signals of pain or fatigue or these different experiential phenomenon. And that's going to make you want to stop because it's going to be so unpleasant. But those things that you're feeling might not really matter.
They might not even be correlated to actual measurable fatigue.
Exactly. And one of the things that I always love doing when I run someone through a physiological assessment is after the assessment, I'll ask them, hey, what were you experiencing? What stopped you from doing this Metcon? And the reason that I love asking people this is because they're always completely wrong. The things that actually limit them aren't things that they're really experiencing. Or if they are, it's not the thing that they connected that sensation of fatigue to.
Can you give me a much more clear example of that?
Yeah. So for example, let's say you have an athlete who's limited by their cardiac output. They're not going to tell you at the end of a Metcon, my heart was like working really hard. Like I felt my cardiomyocytes like beating and I had to stop. It's like, oh no, my arms or legs blew up and my muscles were burning. So I stopped. Well, we need to think about why they're going to experience that. If they're creating a lot of tension in the muscle and their heart's trying to push through that tension, well, they're going to experience a sensation of blowing up in the muscle because they're not able to get enough venous return and blood's not getting back to their heart. But in and of itself, that's not going to make them just stop out of nowhere. The brain has to be uncomfortable with that situation for those feelings of pain or fatigue to get generated. And if we think about an athlete who's limited by their cardiac output, there's a very good reason why their brain would be uncomfortable with that scenario. Imagine we just vasodilated all of our working muscles.
So open up all of the blood vessels throughout the entire body at one time. What happens?
So the analogy that I like to use, if you had your house right now and you turn on your sink and you have your normal water pressure, imagine if you expanded all of your pipes by just like a centimeter or two in terms of diameter. And let's say the pump that was pressing the water into your house is the exact same pump. What's going to happen when you open up your faucet? Nothing's going to come out.
Either no pressure or extremely low water pressure, right?
Exactly. And our bodies work in a really similar way. So imagine that pump is your heart and those pipes in your house are your veins and arteries and your blood vessels. So if someone were to truly vasodilate all of their skeletal muscle, so all those blood vessels opened up, their heart wouldn't be able to maintain their arterial blood pressure. So it'd be like low water pressure. But if that happens in your body, you're going to die very quickly. You're not going to get enough blood to your brain and your respiratory system and all of your vital organs. So your brain's always going to exert a protective effect. So in any human being, that's a real legitimate threat. If you vasodilate too much, you're going to black out. But our brain has evolved a lot of defense mechanisms to make sure that doesn't happen.
Like what, for example?
One would be like an arterial baroreceptor. So if you were to bend over really quick right now and stand up, the reason that you don't black out when that happens is because your brain is adjusting, it's giving you neurological input to either clamp down on those blood vessels or let the tension off a little bit. And that's going to modulate how much blood's getting into your muscle and it's going to regulate your blood pressure.
Can that play a role in why some movements, say like burpees or even handstand pushups, where someone's inverting themselves? Does that baroreflex play a role in the experience of fatigue that people have during those movements?
Yeah, that's definitely going to play a role there. And the other thing that it's going to do is it's going to make a whole body activity like CrossFit really difficult for some people. If we were to pop you on a bike right now and you're just spinning on a watt bike where it's only a lower body component, something like a baroreceptor isn't going to play a big factor because you're not really going to have issues regulating your blood pressure. You're going to vasoconstrict the muscles in your upper body and kind of clamp down on those blood vessels, and you're going to vasodilate your lower body. And this is going to make it that you could redirect more blood flow towards the muscles in your lower body, and that's going to make you really efficient on that bike. But what happens if now you hop off that bike and you want to go do a big set of chest to bar pull-ups? Well, now what you have to do is vasoconstrict other muscles and vasodilate the muscles that used to be working ones and kind of redirect that blood flow. That's going to be really problematic for someone whose brain is trying to defend their heart by creating tension in different muscle groups and kind of clamping down on those blood vessels. So it essentially makes it so they can't turn something like CrossFit, which is typically an acyclic sport, they can't make it look like cyclical work in the muscles. So they don't have steady blood flow. They don't have steady oxygen levels in those muscles. Instead, it makes CrossFit look like circuit training in those athletes.
Is this a function of a lack of cardiac output for those athletes, that their pump just isn't strong enough to move blood, and so their brain's trying to protect them? Like, what's the underlying mechanism here?
So it could be that. It could truly just be an issue with cardiac output, so it is insufficient, but it could be other factors as well. It could be that someone isn't very coordinated, so they're contracting the muscle harder than they need to produce a given unit of force. And if we think about contracting your muscle really hard, well, you're going to restrict what's called venous outflow, so the amount of blood leaving your muscle and getting back to the heart. So if you're doing a Metcon and you're constantly contracting the muscle too hard, then you're going to be limiting the amount of blood getting back to your heart between contractions. In the circulatory system, it's a giant closed loop system. So the amount of blood that leaves your heart, it's the same blood that's getting back to your heart. If less of it's getting back to your heart, less is going to leave your heart. That's going to directly impair your cardiac output. And this is why you remember maybe 5-6 years ago in competitive CrossFit when using like West Side dynamic effort methods was like the thing that everyone did.
Yeah, for sure.
And inevitably, everyone started getting worse at Metcons with like very high rep squats and things of that nature, because if you're training yourself to accelerate a bar as fast as possible on every rep, that's great if your goal is absolute strength development. That's a really shitty adaptation if your goal is to do 100 thrusters as fast as you can, because you're making it more likely that you're going to over contract that muscle and you can't get blood back to your heart.
So you're driving up, like essentially you're bolstering neural drive to the point that even with a light barbell, people are getting higher neural drive than they need. That's the problem of like, you watch someone cycling touch and go 75-pound power snatches, and it looks like each one is a maximal effort rep because they've trained, in Olympic weightlifting and almost Olympic weightlifting exclusively. You see them using the same technique and effort to move that 75-pound snatch that they would a 275-pound snatch, and they're basically just blowing themselves up.
Yeah, even more like coaching CrossFit group classes back in the day. You get that new guy in the class and he comes from like a strength sport background or a bodybuilding background. You watch them on the rower, and the rower looks like a leg press into like an upper body row. It's not a fluid movement for them. They're essentially doing like a leg press and then rowing really hard with their upper body. And that's using way more forces required to actually hold a given pace. And you see over time, people become more coordinated. They learn how to time these things properly. And what that improvement in timing and coordination is going to do is it's going to ensure that they're actually getting blood back to their heart and they're not contracting the muscle harder than they need to. The row is a really simple example, and it's so obvious when someone's rowing without smooth rhythm. But if we were to go out on the floor right now and even look at competitive athletes doing CrossFit, do you think that all of them are moving with fluidity in a bar muscle up or a strict handstand push-up or a touch and go power snatch?
Far from it. And one of the things that you observe when you watch really talented or really high level CrossFitters next to, say, mid-level or sanctional bubble or open level athletes is just the fluidity that the elites move with, and how crisp some of their movements are, and then how fluid their chest to bars are. Like, it's just a very different, you're watching two very different movers when you're watching people who have really spent a lot of time refining their craft versus people who do it, as just part of their training. So it's a big difference, and definitely a factor in someone's performance. So this is one of the types of fatigue that you're talking about, or one of the mechanisms of fatigue. So some sort of like cardiac output, blood pressure related mechanism where the brain is adjusting blood pressure and basically putting on the brakes when it notices that blood pressure is either getting too low or too high based on that person's individual circulatory system.
I did like what you said there, though. You said it doesn't come to the heart, so it doesn't leave the heart. Isn't that the truth, boys? I mean,
to the heart, from the heart.
Yep. That's how you create monsters out there. You know, not enough love goes to the heart. So no love can leave the heart.
Comes out. That's right. Well,
deep, Evan, deep.
Yeah. Deep, Chris, man. Good pickup.
Trying to go really poetic on this episode.
All right. Moving on from that, Chris, what are some of the other mechanisms of fatigue? You mentioned that there were probably 3 primary mechanisms of fatigue here.
Yeah. And if we're going from like a big surface level, I mean, it could also be that someone's actual diaphragm muscle is fatiguing. So in that case, they would actually have some similar downstream effects of that, but that would be a case where they're able to get blood to the working muscle effectively and they could utilize oxygen in the muscle, but they're not getting enough air into their body and they're not getting enough carbon dioxide out. I don't know if it's even necessary to explain these things to athletes. I think what's more important is understanding, well, regardless of what system is becoming that limiting factor, why does the brain stop them from pushing themselves really hard? Like, what is the consequence? Have you ever seen someone black out doing a Metcon in a CrossFit gym?
Not to date, which I've actually watched a lot of Metcons. So no, I've not yet seen anyone black out in the middle of a Metcon.
And that's always something that's really interesting to me because I come from a cross-country running background. You do see people run themselves to the point of blacking out in cross-country running, and you do see it in some other endurance sports. So why is it that never happens in a Metcon? I think there's actually a really good reason for that. And it's because that sensation of fatigue associated with doing a Metcon, because there's so many different fatigue inputs, is so much greater. So no one's really able to completely block those signals out and run themselves to the point of exhaustion.
When you say fatigue inputs, what exactly do you mean by that? Is that sensory information coming into the brain? What exactly is that?
Yeah, so it could be sensory information. When we think about something like CrossFit, there's diaphragm fatigue, which that's both going to inhibit the ability to get air in and CO2 out, but the diaphragm's also a major spinal stabilizer. Right. So your brain's not going to let you completely fatigue that diaphragm muscle. That's going to open you up for a risk of injury. You also need to regulate your blood pressure. So that's going to both impact the heart and that's going to create some neurological feedback because you need the brain to regulate your blood pressure.
And there's a connection between CO2 and blood pressure as well. So if people's respiratory system is dysfunctional, whether because the diaphragm's fatigue or the respiratory muscles are fatigued, that could also play a role in regulating blood pressure as well, right? Yep. So you're starting to see that all these things are a little bit connected in some way as well.
Exactly. And we could keep expanding this list out and out and out, and we'll just end up with a list of dozens of things that are going to create some sort of sensory information that the brain's going to have to interpret. And the brain doesn't want you to push to the point that it's dangerous. And this gets into that idea of a central governor model. It's more popular in terms of Tim Noakes's version of the central governor, which is from the 90s, maybe?
Yeah. So really quick, coming back to your point, what you're saying is that with CrossFit versus endurance sport, in endurance sport, there's basically like 1 or maybe 2 fatigue sensations or sensory inputs to the brain. So the brain looks at it and says, we can keep going. And people keep going to the point that they pass themselves out. But in CrossFit, there's so many different sensory inputs that the brain basically says, all right, we've got a 5 out of 10 here. We've got a 7 out of 10 on this one. We've got a 6 out of 10 on this one. We have a 9 out of 10 on this one. We're just going to cut off exercise.
Yeah. And I think another thing that's really important to consider as well is that the brain calculates our safe exertion limits based on past experience as well. So when we're talking about a high level endurance athlete, like if I think of how many times I've personally run the 800 meter, it might be somewhere between 75 and 100 times in a true race where you're doing it all out. Have you done any CrossFit workout 75 to 100 times the same test?
Not a chance.
Exactly.
I've done the movements way more than that, but never in the specific combinations that and time domains. No, never.
Ooh, I want to flag that. Remind me to ask you a question, but continue.
Yeah. So essentially what an endurance athlete's brain is doing when they are passing out the end of an 800 is they're miscalculating those fatigue sensations to the point that person is essentially passing out. And in CrossFit, their brain isn't familiar enough with those fatigue sensations in that combination to be able to miscalculate it to the point that someone's going to pass out. And now granted, I'm sure there are people that have passed out doing CrossFit, just to be clear.
And I think part of the thing to consider as well is that one of the differences between a mediocre endurance athlete and an elite endurance athlete, it's not that elite endurance athletes have a higher pain threshold. They feel pain at the same point as everyone else. It's that they have more strategies to cope with pain and they have better strategies to cope with pain. And if we look at some of the pain science literature, the number of strategies and the quality of strategies are things that emerge naturally. It's why I think you can't just read a book about mental toughness and these workout tactics. The only way that you could really develop mental toughness, whatever that means, is to just put yourself in those scenarios over and over, because those strategies have to emerge authentically. And if you've raced this event 75 to 100 times, maybe more, you've developed a lot better coping strategies. So when you're running that race, let's say you're a respiratory limited athlete and you're getting like decreased transit time of the red blood cells in your pulmonary capillaries, well, that's going to start to generate feelings of fatigue and feelings of pain, but you have really good strategies for dealing with this. So when you're getting those signs of fatigue, you're just going to keep pushing past it and you're going to keep pushing past it. And at some point, you're just either not going to get enough oxygen to your brain. I have seen in very high level athletes look at significant peripheral desaturation, which is the amount of O2 getting to their brain, to the point that they will start blacking out. I've had that happen here on the bike where people are like, I'm starting to see spots or my entire arm's gone numb.
Get off the bike now.
Yeah, that's not something you see in beginner athletes, but in elite cross country athletes, there's that. And they also have a very high psychological drive to keep pushing through that. So they literally will push to the point that their brain's not getting enough oxygen. Or from like a central governor perspective, it's like, hey, you're ignoring my signals of pain and fatigue. The only way I'm going to get you to stop running is if I'm just going to shut the lights out and you just see literally people black out 15 feet in front of the finish line and just hit the ground.
Hey, I think a while ago, I don't know if we sidetracked you or not, but you were starting to say that none of the actual, I guess, symptoms or whatever matter so much, but you were saying that the brain shutting down is what's important. And you were starting to go on a track, and I think we sidetracked you, did we? Do you remember?
Man, I don't even
remember. Oh, crap. You were about to say something cool.
He was going on to the profundity. So, well, along those lines, Chris, so like we're talking about the fact that the brain is the primary regulator, like the central governor is the primary regulator. I've heard recently, so more recently, people say, oh, the central governor theory has been debunked. I know in your classroom series on fatigue, you dove into central governor and some of the more modern research on that and like where that stands. Can you give us just like a quick overview of what central governor is? Where does that stand in the literature now? Like how do we understand fatigue now from a psychological or from a brain perspective?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge Tim Noakes's version of the central governor models. What people are like, well, that's not the entire picture. And I agree, that's not the right picture. But
can you just say what his is? Yeah. Since none of us know that. Well,
let's start with where the central governor actually comes from, because Tim Noakes isn't even the one that popularized that theory. So the central governor model actually comes from the late 1800s. It was a physiologist named Angelo Masso, and he came up with the concept of the central governor model. I actually have a quote here that I really like from him. It's, at first sight, fatigue might appear an imperfection of our body, but on the contrary, it's one of its most marvelous perfections. The fatigue increasing more rapidly than the amount of work done saves us from injury, which lesser sensibility would involve for the organism. So it's basically saying if you didn't have these signs of fatigue, you would run yourself to exhaustion or death, which happens in a lot of animals, actually. We think fatigue has to be something that occurs in all organisms, but persistence hunting would actually prove that not the case. So what fatigue really is it's this protective mechanism. And when this central governor concept was created, it was actually based on a really mechanistic explanation. Angelo Masso and later on Archibald Hill in, I think, 1923 were the ones that both kind of pioneered this concept. And where they started was with the governor on a car. So in any car, maybe not yours because it's electric, there's something called a governor. And you have piston in the car and you have these two balls that revolve around it. And when you rev a car's engine up too fast, those balls will move out and they'll basically stop the engine from spinning with such high rotations per minute where it could damage your engine. So Masso, Archibald Hill, they observed this phenomenon in the car and they just thought this has to apply to a human being as well in light of all the things that we're seeing. But that was in conflict with what was the main paradigm of fatigue in the early 1900s and late 1800s, which was called the catastrophic model of fatigue, that you just exercise really hard and then some catastrophe happens in your body and you'll just drop dead. This is when they legitimately believed that the first person to run a sub 4 minute mile would die the second they crossed the finish line, which is
obviously not true.
Yeah, which is absurd given that high school athletes do that now. And the central governor model was completely ignored for the next 70 years until Tim Noakes picked it back up in the 1990s. And he had updated the model a lot instead of using a car analogy, because obviously our body doesn't work like a...
It's not that mechanistic. It's not a machine in the way that a car is, right?
Yeah, Tim Noakes' version of it is, well, instead it's all about the brain. The brain has neurologically calculated safe exertion limits based on all of these different factors that come up with our perception
levels
of fatigue.
And
And again, that's part of the picture. And where people start to try and refute Tim Noakes' models, they're like, well, what about Jerome Dempsey's literature on the respiratory metaboreflex, where you just exercise so hard that your diaphragm fatigues and then you cut off blood flow to your arms and legs and you stop. That's the thing that causes us to stop in workouts. And I think it would be a mistake to see Jerome Dempsey's work and Tim Noakes' work as competing concepts. Instead,
I almost feel like Noakes' work could encompass the respiratory metaboreflex model, right? Like where Noakes' model is like, okay, the brain is the ultimate, is the end all be all. And that respiratory metaboreflex is just another one of those sensations that the brain is calculating or taking into account when fatigue applies.
Yeah. And this is where we get into a concept created by someone named Jörg Feldman, who's a physiologist as well, a little bit lesser known than both those other individuals. And Jörg came up with this concept of an extended central governor model. So yes, the brain is a part of the central governor model like Tim Noakes asserted, and Jerome Dempsey's metaboreflex is a part of it. But instead, the extended central governor takes into all of the things that are going to factor into fatigue: temperature, energy regulation, oxygen availability in the muscles, literally list out dozens of different phenomenon. And all of these things are going to amalgamate together and get fed into the brain, which is the central controller, and that's going to dictate our perception of fatigue. So now, instead of getting into these very simple one-to-one phenomenons, we're thinking of a ton of different things happening at once. And as a result of that, when we're thinking about someone's ability to push to those limits of their performance, we need to actually start figuring out, well, what is the rate limiting factor in this person's body? If your issue is that it's your cardiac output, well, I need to understand that as a coach, because otherwise, if I'm trying to get your performance better, I have to realize that you're not actually performing to your potential. If you, Kyle Ruth, have not blacked out and died while you were at this Masters competition that you won, you did not perform to your potential. So,
I only got close in one workout.
Yeah, got close in one workout, right? And that doesn't count. So instead, we need to figure out, well, which of these systems is getting pushed close enough to its point of failure that that's generating these signals that your brain's going to interpret and want to slow you down. If we could identify which of those it is, now we could push that up and kind of raise the ceiling. And that's going to lessen your sensation of fatigue, and that's going to make you perform better. And to really hit home how big our perception actually dictates our performance, there's this amazing study where they took very high level power lifters. And to give you a perspective, these are guys that weigh about 185 pounds and they're bench pressing about 400 pounds.
Yeah, so they're very elite level power lifters.
Yeah. And imagine working with an athlete like that. How many pounds do you think they're putting on their bench press in a year? What? Yep. Half a pound, maybe?
Yeah, I was going to say 1 to 2 pounds would probably be a really good year for them.
These were all natural athletes. They told all of them in the study they were administered a drug and they were told that they were taking androgenic anabolic steroids. And within 2 weeks, on average, they all added 10 to 15 pounds to their bench press. And you think about that rate of adaptation.
I always think of strength performance as something that's unchangeable psychologically, right? Mm-hmm. So I think about endurance performance and I look at how much someone can just kind of overcome the sensations of fatigue. But when it comes to strength performance, like a bench press or a back squat, I kind of think of it like, you've got what you've got, but that's definitely not the case. Mm-hmm. Like you're not just limited even strength performance isn't just limited by the strength of the muscle tissue. I mean, it has a lot to do with the brain regulating, neural drive and output and all those things. And this is such a good point that even when it comes to things that seem fixed, like strength, there's a massive psychological component.
The best part, so after the guys tested in, all of them had these improvements in performance. The researchers told them, we lied to you. None of you were taking steroids. And you'd think that this would trigger something in these athletes. I was always capable of these feats.
Yeah, look how amazing I actually already was.
When they retested them, all of their strength levels returned back to their baseline. None of them were able to retain that increase in strength from when they thought they were taking steroids.
So what I need to do, this is such a terrible idea. Convince all my athletes that they're on, no, it's an awful idea.
Yeah, I've thought about the one. I'm like, what if I just give everyone sugar and tell them?
Yeah, use the placebo effect to
Why were you bringing that up though?
Oh, so just basically proving the point that we're not really tapping our physical potential even when we think we are. We always have more in the tank, and the same thing applies for endurance performance as well. I've heard stories of mile runners at a very high level where the person calling off splits will actually mess up.
Yeah.
The runner will be at like a 60-second 400 pace for their first split, and the person will say, I'm messing this up. Basically, they'll be running at a given pace, and the person will say it's much faster than what they're running, and that will trigger something. Them like, hey,
I'm going to set a PR.
I'm sustaining a much faster pace than I've ever run, and it feels so easy compared to what I'd think. And then it tricks the athlete into thinking, hey, if I'm feeling this good, like I'm just going to tear this up. And then they end up hitting a huge PR because the person messed up the mile splits.
There's actually some of the original central governor research done by Noakes included them lying to people about paces and lying to people about distances and seeing people get massive PRs in time trials and time to exhaustion type things. So I think there's clearly a big psychological component, and it goes a lot deeper than just like we started by talking about the stories that people are telling themselves. Oh, I'm being limited by lactate. But obviously fatigue is way more complex than that. And you can't just boil things down to one simple story. And I almost think that if you could get athletes to stop telling themselves stories about why they're being fatigued and just recognize that fatigue are sensations and you're just something that you're going to continue to go through, learning that strategy for coping with fatigue might be a much better way to deal with it so that they're not creating these false narratives that are essentially self-limiting. Mm-hmm. I mean, is that something that you would try to do with your athletes, or you do with your athletes yourself?
Yeah. So I don't, unless it's athletes that really want to know about the physiology, I actually don't talk about physiology with athletes. One of my things where I'm like, okay, I'll give you a very basic idea of what your limitations are. But instead, what I'll try and do is find like the strings that we could pull on to get the best performance. So if someone thinks that fuel is going to be a limiter for them, explain that that's never really going to be the case for them. But then also take advantage of it and be like, hey, let's try using this pre-workout like carbohydrate mix. And this is going to give you a nice boost in performance, knowing that it's not really going to do all that much. But they could kind of build these psychological triggers that, hey, I take this 25 gram carbohydrate bolus before my event, and that's going to have some kind of performance improvement. And then you let these things compound over time, and it becomes like a ritualized thing for doing events. But I think a large part of dealing with these sensations of fatigue in athletes is explaining that, hey, just because you're hurting right now doesn't actually mean that you can't keep going as well. Like I always say to people, like, you're never going to fail a rep on a burpee. So even though you want to stop right now and you think you need to slow down, you don't actually need to slow down.
I don't know, Evan, there have probably been times where I
failed a rep on the rower once. What was that, 2 years ago? That open workout with the rower? Mike has video of me.
I thought you were
rep.
I thought you were going to say when you were wearing the Slipknot mask and your jumpsuit on the rower, because it looked like you failed.
That was terrible.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've gotten stuck to the floor in a burpee and unable to press myself off the floor.
Yeah, I also recall
it was lactate, clearly.
Yeah, it was definitely the lactate. I also recall judging you in an open workout like 5 years ago, where you had like mumbled something to me and I didn't know what you said. I was like, what? And then you just looked at me and went, and
obviously I wasn't that fatigued because I was able to yell at you at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I've never been so scared in my first week of working at Training Think Tank.
Sorry,
But what I was going to say is one of the things that's made this really apparent to me is a lot of my athletes do use technologies like Moxie or things of that nature. And if we know that the amount of oxygen you have in the muscle is really going to be a large dictator of your performance, and we could get proxies on your blood flow trends, you could very clearly see when someone's giving up and they actually have something in the tank. Like if we have an athlete do a 30-second Wingate test, just ramping up a bike as high as they can and hanging on for dear life, and they start slowing down 20 seconds in and they finish it, and I'm like, man, I'm watching your oxygen trends. You could have sustained that output from 20 seconds on. You're physically capable of that, but you didn't. So if you could even tell athletes like, hey, you're able to do much better than what you just did, that in and of itself could help people realize.
I mean, that's a challenge. So on the one hand, you can look at the athlete and you can say, look, I know for a fact that you have more in the tank and I can show you that. So maybe for some athletes that would build confidence. They'd get done and they'd be like, yeah, maybe I did have more in the tank. You know, they do that post hoc analysis that everyone does. And they're like, yeah, I had more there. Mm-hmm. Then you have another subset of athletes where you show them that and they immediately go into the negative downward spiral where they're like, yeah, I know I'm so weak. I'm so mentally weak. And you know what I mean? Like on one hand, showing them that could improve performance. And on the other hand, it could sabotage their future performance. I think having the ability to show athletes that could be a valuable tool, but it could also be a way to backfire.
Yeah, and I think that's where it becomes really important to talk about coping strategies in particular, because someone might get down on themselves. Yeah, I'm so weak, I didn't go through this. It's like, no. That's not something to like talk down on. Like, you just haven't developed the tools to actually go there yet. So you didn't stop because you were weak, or you didn't stop because you're not tough. That is another story that you're telling yourself. The reason that you stopped prematurely might be because you just don't have the experience putting yourself in that scenario. You're a young athlete. You didn't compete in a pain sport before CrossFit. Maybe you played baseball or something like that, but you weren't an endurance athlete where you're really accustomed to pushing yourself till you're going to throw up. So you really just need to put in the hours and get accustomed to that and develop these coping strategies. The athletes that are also your age that are able to push to that brink, maybe talk to them and see what are their training backgrounds. Did they swim competitively? Did they do, were they a wrestler? Like, have they been in a sport where they're accustomed to that? Because if they have, it's not that they're tougher than you. They've just had more time to develop these tools or like sharpen the sword, so to speak.
To deal with the fatigue that they're experiencing.
All right, Evan, say all that one more time, really loud and clear, so everybody takes it home. Huh? I feel like people definitely need to hear that. And if you weren't really paying attention when he said it, run it back.
So if you weren't paying attention, if you are dealing with one of those athletes where you're worried about telling them they have more in the tank is going to create this feeling of self-doubt or this negative spiral, what they really need to learn is that they're not incapable of pushing themselves to the brink because they are weak or because they're not tough or just because they're a piece of shit, whatever negative story they're telling themselves. It's just because they haven't had the time to develop the tools needed to push themselves to that brink. The athletes who are capable of doing that, it's not because they're innately tougher people or better athletes. It's just because they've developed those tools over time.
I didn't mean literally. I just meant that was
Damn it, Chris.
I just meant that was such a good point that they need. It was.
I love Chris's trolling on this.
Oh God.
Yeah,
you should know not to fuck with me.
I think that's such an excellent point that I've always wondered how much the training tools that I use and how much of the training that I write is actually improving something physiological. So for the longest time, it would be like, oh, I'm trying to improve this athlete's cardiac output. Or I'm trying to improve this athlete's lactate threshold or something like that. But what was probably improving their performance, the thing that was probably getting them to elicit better performance in CrossFit or in Metcons or their engine or whatever, was actually them just being able to psychologically deal with more pain. Mm-hmm. More metabolic fatigue, whatever you want to call it. They're becoming more accustomed to the types of fatigue sensations that are being elicited by those cardiac output protocols or by those lactate threshold protocols because they lacked experience in those domains prior to that. I think that's the big, in the end, is it really that we're adjusting their physiology or making these big inroads in cardiac output? Maybe. We don't even really know.
And I think it's important to acknowledge is it the mental side or is it the physical side? And the answer is just like, yes.
Yeah,
like
two sides of the same coin.
Because your physiology is going to constrain your performance. But if someone's physiology is this well developed and they don't have those coping strategies and they're performing down here, improving their physiology isn't going to do anything because they need to raise that lower ceiling. Now, if you have an athlete who's truly working close to their physical potential, now you need to improve the physiology, but it's always kind of doing that dance and figuring out which one needs to be built, which one needs to be maintained. And I think an important thing to acknowledge, because this might be misleading based on what we're talking about with putting yourself in these scenarios to develop these coping strategies, that doesn't mean to just go like shit can yourself with Metcons for the next week, because there's also the idea that it needs to be a graded stimulus or a graded exposure. It's similar to if you're dealing with like a chronic pain client and maybe they don't have any structural damage, you're not going to go like, hey, get under the bar and go do a 1 rep max back squat. It's like maybe you just have them do like a standing knee extension without load and then maybe an air squat. And over time, you could build them up in load. And the same thing when we're developing these coping strategies, you need to take a really gradual approach, because if you hit someone too hard with too much volume and too much intensity, it's actually going to have the opposite effect where they're going to create associations of being overwhelmed with pain.
So essentially like a PTSD type thing. Now it's not PTSD, but like that type of thing where they get shocked so badly by the stress that they create these negative associations with that type of training. Max has actually talked about that a lot, that when he was training in CrossFit, he did so much really high intensity work that for the longest time anytime he would even think about getting on the assault bike, he would start sweating and have like cold sweat kind of thing. I think there's definitely something to that. I also, that's something that the graded exposure component of this is something that we actually talked a lot about in the limiter bridge performance series in the classroom, where, the bridge portion of someone's training is really built to be a confidence building tool, right? Something where you're slowly bringing people into the fatigue sensations of the sport versus what we used to do, which was like take someone from this big physiological limiter based training and go, okay, now you're going to do metcons and just drop them into it. And it's like, well, that wasn't successful. Why wasn't it successful? Because you basically took them from something and then dropped them into what would be the hardest variation that you possibly could, and then expected them to just thrive from that. And it's not the case. Yeah. So Evan, just to quickly summarize some of the things that we've talked about today. So first off, fatigue is not necessarily what people perceive. The type of fatigue sensation that someone feels is not necessarily associated with something physiological in the body. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, or the sensation of fatigue that they're experiencing or the feeling in their muscle, it's non-specific to whatever is actually limiting them. So you could have 10 athletes saying my muscles were burning up and that's why I stopped. And they could all be actually getting pushed to the brink of failure for 10 different reasons. So as coaches, we always need to keep in mind whatever someone is feeling is important to an extent, but that's not necessarily the thing that needs to be improved to get them to go further, longer, whatever it is.
Well, where can people learn a little more about fatigue? I know you have some stuff in the classroom on it. What are the primary series that they should check out in the classroom?
Yeah, so I recently did a whole entire series on just fatigue science in and of itself. We also did one called The Anatomy and Physiology of an Elite CrossFit Athlete. So both of these definitely get into the nuance of all these different limiters that athletes could have and how to actually bring these limiters up so you could go and improve someone's performance.
Well, thanks for listening, guys. Chris?
And I flagged you a while ago because I wanted to come back. So let's answer that and then we'll shut it down. You said that CrossFit athletes likely don't do, like endurance athletes, we were talking about the 800. They don't do the 800 over and over and over again. And I wanted to flag you and ask you, is there any merit to them maybe thinking about doing that?
That's a hard one because to one extent, their sport's never going to test them on the same event over and over and over again. So I feel
like they learn these strategies better by sticking with one thing that's exactly the same.
To an extent, but it doesn't mean that those skills are going to be generalizable. Like my background, I raced anything from an 800 meter to a 5K, and the coping strategies that I would use in those two events were completely different coping strategies. So if I were to just race the 800, it wouldn't make me a better 5K runner and vice versa. So for a CrossFit athlete, I think there's something to doing this sport frequently and just working on developing different coping strategies in different scenarios. But I wouldn't even necessarily say, hey, pick this one Metcon and just keep doing it over and over and try and develop really good strategies for that specific Metcon.
Got it. All right.
That's it, guys. Thank you.